So this is page 443, where he already like tackled in the before in the book, the so-called enemies of the Enlightenment, and now he turns his attention to a thinker that I hope I'm not being unfair to Steven Pinker. I'm not convinced that he's actually read Nietzsche, but we will adjudicate this, I guess, as this goes on. So this is the way that he characterizes Nietzsche. After laying out the logic of humanism, I noted that it stood in stark contrast to two other systems of belief. We have just looked at theistic morality. Let me turn to the second enemy of humanism, the ideology behind resurgent authoritarianism, nationalism, populism, reactionary thinking, even fascism. By the way, all things that absolutely Nietzsche was against, except for authoritarianism.
Right.
As with theistic morality, the ideology claims intellectual merit, affinity with human nature, and historical inevitability. All three claims we shall see are mistaken. Let's begin with some intellectual history. If one wanted to single out a thinker who represented the opposite of humanism, indeed, of pretty much every argument in this book, one couldn't do better than the German philologist Friedrich Nietzsche. Earlier in the chapter, I fretted about how humanistic morality could deal with a callous, egoistic, megalomaniacal sociopath. Nietzsche argued that it's good to be a callous, egoistic, megalomaniacal sociopath. It's just so fucking this is just, anyway, not good for everyone, of course, but that doesn't matter. The lives of the mass of humanity, quote, the botched and the bungled, the chattering dwarves, the flea beetles, count for nothing. What is worthy in life is for a Superman or Ubermensch, literally overman, to transcend good and evil, exertable to power, and achieve heroic glory. Only through such heroism can the potential of the species be realized and humankind lifted to a higher plane of being. The feats of greatness may not consist, though, in curing disease, feeding the hungry, or bringing about peace, but rather in artistic masterworks and martial conquest. Western civilization has gone steadily downhill since the heyday of Homeric Greeks, Aryan warriors, helmeted Vikings, and other manly men. It has been especially corrupted by the, quote, slave morality of Christianity, the worship of reason by the Enlightenment, and the liberal movements of the 19th century that sought social reform and shared prosperity. Yeah, shared prosperity. We just talked about the shared prosperity, 152 trillion drained from the global south since 1960. Mm-hmm. Such effete sentimentality led only to decadence and degeneration. Those who have seen the truth should, quote, philosophize with a hammer and give modern civilization the final shove that would bring on the redemptive cataclysm from which a new order would rise. Lest you think I'm setting up a straw Ubermensch, here are some quotations. So here's the first quote from Nietzsche. I abhor the man's vulgarity when he says, what is right for one man is right for another. Do not to others that which you would not that they should do unto you. The hypothesis here is ignoble to say to the last degree. It is taken for granted that there is some sort of equivalence in value between my actions and thine. Here's a second quote. This is from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a novel that Nietzsche wrote, right? Not a work of nonfiction. I do not. Oh, sorry, not we're not there yet. This is a separate quote. I do not point to the evil and pain of existence with the finger of reproach, but rather entertain the hope that life may one day become more evil and more full of suffering than it has ever been. So in the second quote, just to be clear, when Nietzsche is talking about suffering in general, he's not just talking about some callous sociopath that without reason exerts a will to power and forces everybody else into slavery. He is actually, usually when he's talking about suffering, it is the suffering of the self, right? It is oftentimes his own suffering, right? Nietzsche often said he wants to make something of his own suffering. He basically says that, when we're talking about human values, is it possible that compassion is not, the only basis for morality? Can suffering also be a basis for morality? Does personal suffering lead to anything of value? And can historical, when he talks about historical suffering, can historical suffering lead to anything of value? What is interesting is that Pinker answers the question in the affirmative again and again and again and again. Do we have all these corpses that we stand upon with Native Americans that are, genocided away? Or, a slavery that is done to present an additional unit of GDP, or colonialism that allows Pinker to have a cheap laptop on which that he, writes his books? Pinker's answer is yes. Nietzsche answers in the affirmative as well, but Nietzsche doesn't dress that up in like anything that's highfalutin or anything that's like, trying to, deny that this reality exists. He says yes, right? He's not ashamed to say that. When he talks about an overman, that overman will not be ashamed to say yes, just like Pinker is not ashamed to say yes. But Pinker, the reason why Nietzsche would absolutely hate Pinker is Pinker does not want to take the next step and say, well, maybe I could be an overman. Right? Maybe I could play that historical role. Nietzsche would say, what a fucking coward. He's willing to step on the corpses of the past, and he's willing to write these books extolling these virtues of the West, but he's not willing to actually take the next step, rip off the fucking Band-Aid and say that, what, I could be this overman because look at me, I'm writing these great books, on the corpses of others, right? This is where the disagreement will come in. So another quote, and this is a quote from a novel, right? Thus Spoke Zarathustra is a novel. Mm-hmm. Man shall be trained for war, and woman for the recreation of the warrior. All else is folly. Thou goest to woman, do not forget thy wit. And he's using this quote, right, to show that, well, he's sexist, he's militaristic, which, it is true. Like Nietzsche, he was a great fan of Napoleon. He wasn't a fan of Germany. He wasn't a fan of his own country, but he was a great fan of Napoleon. He definitely has a militaristic streak. But it's odd to use this quote explicitly because, and also he was a very sexist. I think her name is Salome, the woman that he was in love with. His most sexist remarks actually coincided with the time that Salome refused his entreaties for marriage. Yeah. And in fact, like when he would like send around his books to like women that he did know, he would say like please don't take some of these statements personally, because he sort of he was kind of like the proverbial incel, right, before we had that term. And he was sort of aware that there would be this negative response. But the reason why using this quote for this is so odd, it's not even so much that it doesn't necessarily capture his sexism. I mean, I guess it does in some ways, but the reason why in the scope of the novel it doesn't is, so, Zarathustra approaches this woman and she tells this to him. And later on in the book, he approaches the same woman later after Zarathustra undergoes his psychological changes. And he says, remember when you told me that, do not forget thy whip. Guess what? I'm going to now try to whip you. And she stops him and corrects him and says, but how could you say that? You really wish to whip me when I imparted all this knowledge to you, when I made you greater than, when I gave you this Nietzschean morality. And you cannot do this to your co-equal, because although I am a woman, I have accomplished something great by giving you this education. You must treat me as your equal. And guess what? Zarathustra actually says you're right. Right. Mm-hmm. So literally, this quote, it does not work in the way that Pinker thinks. I doubt he's even read the full book. Right. That's the crazy part. Right. He tries to capture this philosophically. I doubt he's read the full book because he would know the multiple contexts under which this quote appears. Right. And the final quote, a declaration of war on the masses by higher men is needed. A doctrine is needed, powerful enough to work as a breeding agent, strengthening the strong, paralyzing and destructive for the world weary, the annihilation of the humbug called morality, the annihilation of the decaying races, dominion over the earth as a means of producing a higher type. So anyway, and just to wrap up Pinker's thoughts on Nietzsche. He basically says that, these genocidal ravings may sound like they come from a transgressive adolescent, because he's been listening to too much death metal or bored parody of James Bondville and blah, blah, blah. But actually, it's from Nietzsche, who was among the most influential thinkers of the 20th century, continuing into the 21st. Later on, he calls him very overrated. He says that Hitler, tapped Nietzsche's philosophy, although Nietzsche wasn't an anti-Semite and in fact would be very much against fascism. And like Pinker kind of like he sort of admits that Nietzsche wasn't an anti-Semite, and you have this in your notes. Maybe you could just take it from here since this is what you were talking about.
Yeah, well, on page 445, this is just another instance where we don't get the full picture, because it says, though Nietzsche himself was neither a German nationalist nor an anti-Semite, so there you go, to your point, he does say that, it's no coincidence that these quotations leap off the page as quintessential Nazism. Nietzsche posthumously became the Nazis' court philosopher. In his final year as chancellor, Hitler made a pilgrimage to the Nietzsche archive, presided over by Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, the philosopher's sister and literary executor, who tirelessly encouraged the connection. Well, even the cursory reading of the Wikipedia or Encyclopedia Britannica article about Nietzsche, first of all, he feuded with his sister throughout their lives because she was a rabid anti-Semite and German nationalist and married one, a man who was as well. And when he died, obviously a fault of his, I don't know exactly why he didn't manage to leave his literary estate to someone else's care, but he left it to her care. Maybe that was just by default because he didn't leave it to anybody, I guess. And she was next of kin, who knows? But she went ahead and collected his, previously uncollected writings into the Will to Power, and gave it no context. Just disseminated it out into the world, and then, as Pinker talks about, his sister tirelessly encouraged the connection to Hitler because she was a Nazi. So, all these ideas were antithetical to Nietzsche's personal philosophy. It's so well documented that he broke ties with Richard Wagner. He broke ties with numerous people who he had grown up with or become friends with over the years, that, their particular fascist, nationalist, anti-Semite views got to be too much for him. And he ended the relationship. He didn't do that with his sister, presumably just because she was his family, even though, again, they were on again, off again, and, throughout the years. So it's just a pretty wicked misrepresentation to act as though, Nietzsche would have loved the fact that Hitler wanted to come, make a pilgrimage to his grave or his workplace or whatever, and then, appropriate all of his writings for the Third Reich. But it's not really explained any further than that in the book.
Yeah.
Right.
It's interesting how, Pinker, he doesn't want to be accused of being intellectually disingenuous. So of course he has to say, although Nietzsche wasn't an anti-Semite, but he doesn't actually tell you the full story, which is the following. Not only was Nietzsche not an anti-Semite, he actually thought that Jews among the world were the most noble and the greatest race and the greatest tribe of people to have ever existed, right? He is so respectful of Jews. He looks back on the past, right? Because this fits so well with Nietzsche morality, right? Look, the reason why Nietzsche is saying stuff like maybe suffering could be one of human values, depending on how it's used, is the fact that, well, look at the Jews, right? The Jews had to go through years and years and years of pogroms. They had to be expelled in every country that they went to, and yet they have produced so much in terms of literature. They've produced so much in terms of culture more broadly. They've become very powerful, even, during Nietzsche's time. We had at that time, before Theodor Herzl, we had a more kind of, just like we had utopian socialism, we had a kind of utopian Zionism, right? With all these people trying to, colonize Palestine. And the reason why they were able to do that is because they had the wealth, they had the means to immigrate. The reason why Israel was able to get so many promises, what became Israel, from, for example, the British, is because they just like today, they have a large number of pressure groups, because over time Nietzsche's argument is that Jews were able to sort of use their suffering to build something from it and to, kind of like become greater than. Now, I think, like, historically speaking, some of that argument is kind of silly. There's a lot of like historical incidents that occurred along the way that, put Jews into power, whereas like, Black people did not have the same opportunity. So, slavery like didn't ennoble like Black people, right? It just fucking, just completely destroyed, Black America for so long, and still has all these ripple effects that, have never gone away. But Nietzsche was so emphatic about the greatness of Jewish people, and in fact, if he were to see Nazism, come about, first of all, he disliked Germany. He thought that Germans were lesser than Jews. If he were to see Nazism come about, to Nietzsche, this would be a prime example of slave morality. Nazism as slave morality itself. The difference, though, is that it's a slave morality that happened to have accumulated enough power to actually, take its, he calls it resentment, right? Later French ressentiment, to take its power and to sort of, force it on others and to destroy others that were greater than the Nazis. So, and, that would be a perfect example, right? Nietzsche believes that Germans are like an inferior, tribe. Suddenly Nazis come about, they claim without evidence that they're greater than, and they end up destroying the truly great tribe, which is the Jews. To him, this is slave morality. This is resentment. This is exactly an example, because to him, powerful or greater than is not simply, like Pinker wants to treat it as, I guess you could say philosophically, there could be a slippery slope to something like fascism. And it's not that, Nietzsche wasn't an authoritarian. In some ways he was, but to Nietzsche, it's not just crass power in terms of like, well, you happen to have like the riches and the guns, so you clearly are the most powerful. That's not a Nietzschean concept. The Nietzschean concept is, here's a people that is noble, that is cultured, that is powerful historically and otherwise, and here is an inferior race to him, the Germans, that see this, they become jealous, they want their money, they want their power, and they're going to exterminate them because they can never produce anything of value in the same way the Jews have. And the fact that like he misses this and doesn't even like offer this as a caveat, except to say, although Nietzsche wasn't an anti-Semite, it is intellectually dishonest, even if he offers the caveat of he wasn't an anti-Semite.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's just so many more layers to that whole situation, like you just highlighted, that just get bounced over. I think maybe more than anything, for the sake of trying to talk about the present counter-enlightenment with Trumpism and this kind of stuff, and say, Nietzsche is still to this day persisting as the kind of person or the kind of philosopher whose ideas are adopted by these authoritarian types and that kind of thing. And I don't know, maybe that's true. It's impossible to think that Donald Trump even knows who Friedrich Nietzsche is.
Yeah.
It's not to say that he, I guess, couldn't be influenced by his ideas through a chain of just, idolizing Mussolini or whatever, or Kim Jong-un. But you know what I'm saying? It's not really realistic to think that Trump's got a copy of Thus Spoke Zarathustra in his cabinet. So anyway,
I actually have like just a few more things, just like, what bothers me so much about like, Pinker's of treatment of Nietzsche here, just to kind of like, I guess, summarize it a bit. So like, first of all, like I said earlier, over and over again, like, Steven Pinker's, philosophy in Enlightenment Now is just suffused with Nietzschean value judgments, right? It's just full of it, right? Whether it's like he's choosing to use a ratio as opposed to absolute numbers, that is a Nietzschean value judgment. Whether, it's the fact that, he's like literally like, typing away on a, slave labor computer, living off of, the bones of everybody that came before him in Canada. Like, it's just suffused with Nietzschean logic. And, what Nietzsche was arguing is that, human beings, no matter where they are, the reason why I don't really consider him kind of counter-enlightenment is this. Just like David Hume says, hey, we need to treat, right, reason as slave of the passions, and it ought to be the slave of the passions, because we can never get beyond this point where, we no longer have to make value judgments, right? We will always have to make value judgments. And Nietzsche, like, he emphasizes just even more than Hume, right? He says we're constantly making these evaluations, these kind of value judgments. Some people are choosing to do it invisibly. I'm going to do it visibly. I'm going to be open about this greater than. But when he discusses things like an overman, or like, the nature of the great man is he has to become cold, he has to become compassionless. It's not simply that he imagines a world where you have just like massive slavery, although that's not even like, beyond the ken of Nietzsche. I don't even want to make that argument. But to him, what he's arguing explicitly there is, if you have a man that is hard, right, is able to sort of look back in the past and say, these corpses do exist. You can't resurrect them. There's nothing to do about that. They have to be now used as fuel for something greater. We could either be honest about it, or we could dick around and dance around the issue as Pinker does, right? And pretends like that's not the calculation that we're making every single day when we choose to buy a new laptop, when we choose to live in the United States and feel happy about our station in life and feel good about the fact that, hey, aren't I so lucky to be, a patriot, in the United States, and everywhere else is so bad. Like, we're constantly making these calculations. It's constantly this idea of this fuel, like moving, upwards for something grander. Right. And also, like, this thing of like, Nietzschean morality is not merely just like a matter of like, he says he wants to get beyond good and evil, because to him, there's another set of values, which is good versus bad, right? Good versus bad meaning excellence versus non-excellence, which again, completely suffuses Pinker's point of view here. Excellence versus non-excellence. What is the excellence here? What is the analog? It's, oh, look at us. We're on a trajectory that's moving forward, that's moving higher. That's the excellence, right? Everything else is just kind of like a side detail, right? Everything else is just, it can be elided because, although like, yes, we have more absolute numbers of people suffering than ever before, absolute numbers of animals going through unprecedented suffering. That is an example of non-excellence, right? The excellence is the trajectory. This is the greatness that we need to latch ourselves onto. So one last point here. What else did I want to say? I guess this whole thing about like humanism, right? Like, when Pinker says that Nietzsche is not a humanist, Nietzsche would absolutely call himself a humanist, right? And the reason why he would call himself a humanist is he's just emphatic about what a human being is, right? And what a human being is capable of compared to everyone else that's not capable of the same, right? And the way that I would frame this is, he has this quote from the Gay Science on, this is like aphorism number 304, right? And if you want to really understand what Nietzschean morality is all about, why it's not necessarily not incompatible with like a leftist methodology or ideology, which is what I have, it is this. So this is aphorism 304 in the Gay Science. It's titled, "By Doing We Forego. At bottom, I abhor all those moralities which say, do not do this, renounce, overcome yourself. But I am well disposed toward those moralities which goad me to do something and to do it again from morning till evening, and then to dream of it at night, and to think of nothing except doing this well as I alone can do it. When one lives like that, one thing after another that simply does not belong to such a life drops off." Same thing with Pinker. He has a laptop. He has books to write. All those other things, all those considerations. Yeah, I'm standing on the fucking skulls of people in the past. Yeah, this was made by slave labor. Yeah, my country has drained 153 trillion from the global south. All of that falls away. That's not part of my life. Those that are suffering, that's their life. That's their lot. That's what they have to deal with. That's not my life. Let everything else fall away. My purpose in life is to write as many books as possible. Without hatred or aversion, one sees This take its leave today and that tomorrow, like yellow leaves that any slight stirring of the air takes off a tree. He may not even notice that it takes its leave. Does Pinker 24/7 worry about slave labor? Is that the thing that's like, oh my God, is he crying every fucking minute of every single day? Because if you were morally like consistent, wouldn't you? Isn't it fucking like absolutely just unspeakable what's happening all around the world historically and to the present day? Right? He may not even notice that it takes its leave, for his eye is riveted to his goal. Forward, not sideward, backward, downward. What we do should determine what we forego. By doing, we forego. That is how I like it. That is my placatum. But I do not wish to strive with open eyes for my own impoverishment. I do not like negative virtues. Virtues, whose very essence is to negate and deny oneself something. Yeah, so so basically my point is this: if this is history and this is our lot, if Pinker is complicit in slavery, as I am, as you are, as everybody is, as we are all complicit historically, if that is the case, what Nietzsche is arguing in his kind of like let's get beyond good and evil is this: the only thing that could possibly redeem all this suffering, it's not Christian white guilt. Oh my God, can you just fucking imagine what's going on, right? It's not constantly crying 24/7, right? The only thing that can possibly redeem it is to do something great based on the fuel that you are given. Again, you cannot resurrect these corpses. You cannot turn this thing that is now fuel into something else. The only thing that you could do is you could waste the opportunity, right? You could live out your life just like fucking snorting cocaine, fucking strippers. That's your indulgence, right? After draining 153 trillion from the global south, right? The only thing that could have any sort of redemptive quality is the Nietzsche morality. This is why he's so adamant about this morality. And the fact that, like Pinker is so dependent on this and yet misses this, it really just rubbed me the wrong way. It's really annoying. Anyway, that's all I have to say about Nietzsche at this point.
Yeah, understood. I think maybe my final thought on that, and then I'll get into my starting to conclude comments, would just be, with all that said, it is still, of course, important to have the right framing. And I do still think that if you're going to go with that Nietzschean morality, to actually literally use some of these Enlightenment values,
yes,
in combination with that is where you can arrive at the right sort of solution. Because you could have someone like Jeff Bezos, who seemingly to me would in certain ways be quite Nietzschean in that chain of reasoning, right? It's like, okay, well, the corpses, all this stuff, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and build a corporation. That's my idea of a greater contribution. That's what I'm going to do. I have the means to do it, the education, the connections, the will.
Yeah. So and would Pinker say that Bezos is a bad guy, or that he's unethical, or that, his property needs to be expropriated? Like, he wouldn't make that argument, I don't think.
Yeah, but most likely not. But the point being, there's still a tipping point for all that stuff. Like at a certain threshold, maybe a company like Amazon is good and helpful for the world. By now, it's long surpassed that, right? Like now, it's a way to just appropriate these same kind of things, and they're doing it at a larger scale than any other corporation, just about, or certainly equally with anyone else, right? Worker conditions are terrible. They're preventing unionization. They're dodging taxes. They're doing all these things that eventually now turn into massive negative externalities, not to mention the fact their whole company is just I guess they have Amazon Web Services, but it's basically just a consumptive machine for humanity, right? So then to go give some money to a charity that's going to help with global warming and commit loosely to some sort of carbon neutral plan, it's like, no, you need to shut your company down, if you want to actually be part of that solution. So you've reached a point there where somebody has maybe for a while been on a decent ascent, and then eventually it just way oversteps its bounds. But you also could have someone, who looks at these same things and decides to, I don't know, be in Congress and actually be someone who advocates for the right kind of legislation. And they could take that as their, Nietzschean morality play, to help on all this. And they do have Enlightenment values at the forefront. You could have somebody who starts, some sort of NGO that can help with this, or you could have someone like a Jason Hickel, right, who's out there saying, well, I'm going to shine light on these issues that I see, and I have privilege. He's from Swaziland, which was actually a colonized African country, so he has some personal experience with this. But present day, he's been living and educated in the U.S. and U.K. for a long time, and he's writing articles for Vox and Al Jazeera and doing talks at Google, right? I mean, he's got a privileged life now, like you and I do, but he's making the efforts to, to take some of that Nietzschean morality and point out the things that need to be pointed out, and hopefully make the right strides. So anyway, it can still be chosen what direction to take it, and more people would need to make that right calculation, I guess, and combine the two. And maybe that's where we can get the next leg up of progress on these things. So, my final comment as we move toward wrapping up, which I put in my show notes to you and maybe mentioned briefly earlier, was just with all of this said, there's nothing really mentioned in this book at all on Pinker's part about the arts and culture and all of this progress that he's going to cheerlead and champion and talk about. That's fine, but especially in the rich developed nations, which now have way more than we ever could possibly need. There's distribution issues, et cetera, all the things we've talked about, but just in general, it's now there. It's been tapped into, right? And it's available. But then for the higher pursuits, what has culture become presently? And where are we with some of these really important things? Because, to a certain extent, especially with things like, the enormous rise of the self-help industry or the fitness industry or, all this different kind of stuff, it's like, these are massive parts of our culture. And they're focused on just continuing to increase happiness and well-being. So to write a whole book about the way that well-being has transformed and come along and, has been and is an obsession in a way for much of humanity. Where do we go from here with extrapolating that forward? Because,
Pinker's answer, like to the extent that he does touch on the arts, it's basically this kind of like, when he gets accused of like scientism, it would be, something like this, like where he says, well, I think, moving forward, the sciences need to combine with the arts and the arts need to combine with the sciences. But he doesn't really offer much beyond that. I don't think he's necessarily like, all, so passionate about the arts. Like that's not his area, right? He and to the extent that, going back to the example of Nietzsche, here's like a great writer that's kind of like put before him. And because he has like, a bunch of like liberal biases and political biases of his own, he has to hold Nietzsche at arm's length. When Nietzsche like talks about some of the things that maybe Steven Pinker in his personal life might feel guilty about, he has to hold Nietzsche at arm's length. And he basically reduces him as something like, he says something like, after like all this negative stuff about Nietzsche, he says like, to his credit, Nietzsche was a lively stylist. That's right. Literally that like you get like this like great fucking writer that's put before you with such memorable passages and so many things that you could bring out of him into your own life for your own psychological well-being, for your own kind of like like navigating your surroundings, and that's kind of like what he comes away with. I mean, I think it's kind of telling, right?
Yeah, I remember that line. There's just that little snippet. It's like giving the slightest shade of credit where it's due in Nietzsche's case. But anyway, that's, and you're right.
Mozart was technically competent.
Right. Yeah. But it's like, and I know that you're not going to get a whole lot of that, if any, commentary about something like the arts in a book like this, but just as someone to whom that matters and is trying to participate in that part of humanity and culture, it just feels very, 2021 continues to feel like a very just improvement of well-being, expansion of consumption type era, and
for some,
yeah,
I guess.
For those who can, for those who have the means to do that, that's what they seem to be focused on. Or even if you are, ostensibly a writer or artist of some kind, it's what is your stuff worth out on the open market? Can you become a multimillionaire? Can you create an NFT of your stuff that now can sell for whatever? I don't know. It's just it's kind of exhausting and frustrating. But
yeah.
Anyway, those chapters remain to be written.